Hello, I'm Sue McGregor. As a member of Mount Saint Vincent University faculty, I'm pleased to have the opportunity to moderate this panel. Mount Saint Vincent University was the first and only independent women's college in the British Empire when the legislature granted it the right to give degrees in 1925. Mount Saint Vincent University continues to be concerned with the higher education of women. The next decade poses new challenges. We are fortunate today to have with us a panel of 4, and Dr. Joyce Kennedy is the Assistant Director for Continuing Ed at the Mount. She is the first woman president of the Institute of Pastoral Training in 35 years. It's the first time they've had a women's president. She taught a women's studies course on women's spirituality at the Mount last summer, and has been a book consultant for Scholastic Books for a number of years. Our second panelist is Dr. Donna Smyth. She is a English and creative writing professor at...
I wonder why we never like to do it once, Sue. We like to do it twice.
Actually, they didn't have it plugged in.
No, it's not exactly true. It's just we're having some wonderful new equipment.
Is it going to be on the monitor?
No.
It's too
Because that's what I was watching for.
So much fun giving you 2
Oh,
minutes.
I'm not talking yet. Oh,
You didn't swap your mics.
This is what was given to me.
Do you want us to do a sound test before we go
Well, we did a lot of sound checks.
I have no idea. I suppose they
This is
are.
the fancy new mic.
Like I say, inconsistent.
Well,
This is
maybe
the
they
wonderful
can-
wireless mic.
Correct way.
Yes, I don't.
Shona, have they got any luck in there?
Can they hear me talking? Well, rehearse your answers, you guys. Here, I was going to let you read that. Sorry about that. They had this all going.
We're being experimented upon.
So will you just point? All right. Because it's a good thing you told me because I was watching the monitor.
Decided not to put the
why.
Really speaking their language, and there class women.
Yes.
You know, to get out there and march.
Test, check. Test. Check, 1, 2, 3, 4. Test, 1, 2. Check. Test, 1, 2, 3, 4. Check. Check. Could I switch microphones?
Okay. As long as you let me take it out of here all by myself.
Is she done?
Yeah, she's done. I'm done. Thank you. Okay. But see, this is the fear that when you become so that like,
But it's the superstition.
you know. Yeah, but how am I going to tack this on me? Whoops. Is that it? Okay, I'm talking.
She had some good things to
Yeah.
say, but it was like, I am the star. In fact, she kept using this, like,
Yeah.
I'm cast on the wrong family.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
Anyway, I think that's.
My God, she's now about to say the new. No, we're the real family. I'm quite critical of the family as an institution.
Well, the family-
and I
afternoon. I'm Sue McGregor. As a member of Mount St. Vincent University faculty, I'm pleased to have the opportunity to moderate this panel discussion on women in education in the 1990s and beyond. Mount St. Vincent University was the first and only independent women's college in the British Empire when the legislature granted it the right to give degrees in 1925. Mount St. Vincent University continues to be concerned with the higher education of women. The next decade poses new challenges. We are fortunate to have with us today 4 panel members. The first I'll introduce is Dr. Joyce Kennedy. She's the Assistant Director for Continuing Education at Mount St. Vincent University. She is the first women president of the Institute of Pastoral Training. For 35 years they've existed. She's the first woman to be president. She has taught a women's studies course at the Mount recently on women's spirituality. And she's been a book consultant for Scholastic Books for a number of years. Our second panelist is Dr. Donna Smyth. She is a currently professor of English and creative writing at Acadia University. She has told me earlier she's a feminist and peace and environmental activist for Forever in Nova Scotia. She was the founding editor of Atlantis, which is a women's studies journal, which is now being published and printed at the Mount, and she's had 2 novels published through Women's Press. The third panelist, as you'll probably recognize, is the former president of Mount St. Vincent University, Dr. Margaret Fulton. She is now adjunct professor at UBC and currently teaching a women's studies course there. She is a women's rights activist and a national and international education consultant. And our final panelist is Dr. Thelma MacCormick. She is a sociologist, an educator, and a former distinguished chair in women's studies at Mount St. Vincent University. She received an honorary degree from the Mount recently, and she's currently teaching at York University. Now we'll open up the panel discussion with a question that gets at the most important issue in the next decade for feminist educators, and I think I'll open up the discussion with Thelma.
Well, Sue, I see universities in a crisis. I think we are having a major crisis in our post-secondary institutions, and I think that the innovations represented by women's studies, both in content and in structure, offer the only way we may save Canadian universities. Now, I know that's putting it in an extreme way, and yet the more I see of how universities operate, and I think I've seen quite a few, I am convinced that there is a real crisis. We are losing students, we are losing committed faculty, and we are losing funding. And until we reconstruct ourselves in the kinds of new alternatives that are represented in women's studies programs, I think we represent the hope of Canadian education for men and women in the 90s. And I think maybe I'll just turn it to my fellow sister panelists.
Thelma, I agree with your comment that there is a deterioration going on. I think that deterioration, however, I view more positively than you do, and I tie it back to what you've said about a need for reconstruction, because the institutions have been so totally hierarchically structured, and the methodologies that have been used have been so typically male methodologies that they're not working anymore. And not only are women students frustrated by the structures and the systems that they're working in, many young male students are equally frustrated by it. So what we have to undertake is a total transformation of the academy, and that is not going to be easy.
Donna?
I really think that this is absolutely right on. I put a number of long-term goals for myself trying to think through this question, which is rather overwhelming when you're being an educator and a feminist. And I think that the transformation of the academy has to match the global village that we're moving into, which has its own realities. And those realities are matched by the realities of women's lives, which are not here yet either. And so we have things like we have to have more interdisciplinary areas of study. We have to have our citizens educated so that they are citizen scientists and not just scientists or not just citizens. We have to bridge that technological gap.
Not just specialists. Part of our problem has been specialization.
Exactly. And we have we know that we have to reform the material conditions of women, which means, in effect, the material conditions of that society, and we are responsible to that world outside of academia. In other words, we don't like the walls that have always enclosed us. And I think there may be a time of crisis when we see the walls coming down and nobody knows quite what to do. On the other hand, it gives us the opportunity to say, there are pluralistic, multi-standard models. We don't need the ideology of excellence in this situation.
I think the point that you're making is a very relevant one. Namely, it's a much more holistic model of knowing the world and knowing it in a very circumventing formal systems and knowing it for purposes of acting on it.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things that's devastating about knowledge is how often it paralyzes us and defuses a kind of social protest. But
Joyce?
I like the idea of interdisciplinary, and I was going to comment on the question. The first question posed to us was a one-shot sort of question. What is the most important thing? And I thought, well, you know, if you think as a woman, in a way, you don't think of the one most important thing because your mind is full of a whole web and network of things that kind of interact. So it was really hard to even approach the question and think about it. But I did think, one of the things I thought about, and I give a very specific example of this, and I couch this in, I suppose, in a negative sort of way. And what I say is that women will recognize that the education they are trying to access is perhaps not the education they want and need. And I think that there's a great deal, for instance, going after science and technology for women and things like that, without questioning the very premises upon which those things exist. And I give a good example. I hear women who have, post-Christian women who have left the churches and say, we can't live with the male savior, but they're living with, for instance, Henry Morgenthau as their savior. And I think it's very interesting to take abortion, which is an issue that has divided women. We just talked about before the panel began. And in Canada, the two champions on either side of the question are men. Joe Borowski is parading around with his little group, and Dr. Morgenthau with his little group. And I find that really interesting that the two who catch headlines and who speak on behalf of all these women are both men, not to get into the issue itself. So I think the danger, or the thing I would look at in education for women in the 1990s and beyond, is that we have to get much more at the roots of the very thing that women have scrambled to be a part of, as you say, because scrambling to be a part of something that's already cast in a certain mold, which is unilateral for the most part, which is not multifarious, which is not engages that way.
But Joyce,
it's the danger.
Don't you think you have to distinguish, however, between what the media pick up as leadership and what they think of as, and the way in which men have access to the means of communication? Both of these are women's movements. Both of them. Those people would be nowhere without strong women's support. And I would sort of add to what you're saying, it's skills in organizing that I think we aren't learning in our formal systems of education. We very often know what our goals are, but somehow these men co-opt the news, the headlines, but we're the ones who are raising the money. We're the ones who are out there marching. We're the ones pushing the baby carriages. And the media, however, are not interested in women's movements. They're interested in men who want to get the headlines.
Well, the problem with the media, and it's a very similar problem within our university communities, that there still exists this notion that there are two sides. Everything is polarized. Exactly. Yeah. And it's not only polarized, but it's also always still perceived in this linear fashion, or this hierarchical or vertical view of society, and that things are going up and down, and some things are right and some things are wrong. I think what we have to do, as Donna said, is look at the globalization and start to relate knowledge to our communities and to ourselves, and perceive the whole concept of learning from a very, very different perspective.
Well, one thing that Joyce mentioned was that women are what they're trying to access is not what they need. And the next question that I was going to ask the panel was that literally, are more women seeking education? And then the further questions are going to address the accessibility variable. Okay, so I mean, I guess we can start with Joyce and say, do you think women are actually seeking education, or are there restrictions to their entry?
I think more women, I mean, the mountains are proof positive that more women are seeking education. More women who are older, too, who are coming out of their homes and out of different places are seeking education. Some of the things that they find, I mean, I take my discipline has been literature for a number of years. I mean, that's what I did my PhD in a very patriarchal model, I may say. And one of the problems that women confront when they enter literature classrooms and they start listening is the whole model of like the expert. I mean, that there's no, and they come away and they drop out of literature and so on. They say, what has this got to do with my life? I mean, it's a kind of, you know, even at that level where you think, well, literature, I mean, you know, surely that's an area where there's a lot of discussion going on. It's not as set as, say, sociology might be or some of the sciences might be.
But it's still packaged.
It's still packaged,
and it's that
exactly.
the way it's
That's
packaged.
Right. And so they run across this, and I know I've heard people, you know, talk about that, and they say, well, I'm just dropping out. I don't want to take Shakespeare. I don't want to take this or that because I don't care what the experts think about that. I want to talk about what this has to do with, you know, where I am and what my life is about.
So do you see that as a barrier, or they find that out after they're in?
It's a barrier in a sense after they get here because they're very eager to have access. I'm not just saying at the Mount, but anywhere where women have come back and they're very anxious to access something. And as a mature woman, if they go in there, young women are still in the old mold for the most part. But older women who come in, they've already had a kind of lived experience, a feminist lived experience in a way. And so when they come into classrooms and find that, I think that's when we find, and the Mount is obviously the place that's trying to do away with that kind of, you know, thinking in the classroom so that teachers, whether men or women, are open to students, you know, to transforming the curriculum, as it were. And so you may study the same subject or you may not, but you study in a different way.
Yeah, I have a favorite example of this in terms of how women think and like to learn is that I was privileged to teach writing at Westwards 4 about a year ago, which was a women's writing retreat on the UBC campus. And we had a group of women who were there to write. Basically, for 2 weeks we lived together and we met each day, and we worked very hard. And what struck me was that these women were on scholarships, many of them, so they were from poor backgrounds and so on. They couldn't have got there without some help. But what struck me is that given a special environment where they had their own space and their own time, and were told that you work and we take your work seriously, the incredible transformation that happened. But it had to happen on a personal level as well as in the writing. And it seems like for women, this direct contact that is personal to the knowledge and back again has to be where we begin. And I think that's really a challenge, because if we're in the formal education system, you have to do that kind of undercover, as it were. And with 40 people to a classroom these days, it's really difficult to hold a one-on-one situation, which especially mature women need that kind of contact. So there are problems with these mature students, but they're a joy to teach, aren't they?
Yes.
Yeah.
But Donna, you lead us straight into the whole problem of the way university education is structured. I think many more women. In fact, the data shows that now over 50% of the undergraduates are all women. Now, certainly 50% of the faculty are not women. There's been very little change on a ratio
17%.
change. In fact, it's deteriorated. But your point about teaching in an environment that is conducive to a different feminist pedagogy and a different methodology, and you get absolutely fantastic results. But when I am again back in the classroom and I'm teaching a women's studies course at UBC, I have 47 students. The front of the classroom has the raised platform. The desks are all nailed down. I mean, you are right away in a situation that requires a kind of dominance methodology. And it's just wrong. and we know it's wrong. But you know, the very building is structured in such a way that you cannot teach in an informed way that is going to do our young people a good service for the future.
I think that's a bad method of teaching anyone,
Yes,
that
yes,
model.
of course it
I
is.
mean,
It's a bad model.
Plato didn't teach students that way. But I think when we talk about access, we have to differentiate between quantitative access and qualitative. And I think although more women want to come to universities, unless the funding crisis is resolved, it will impact differentially in terms of gender. It will be women who will not be funded. It will be mature women who should be there full-time, who will be there part-time. It'll be women who are there part-time who will drop out before they complete their degrees, whatever the system is. So that the access problem is a quantitative and economic problem too, and that's outside of what we can do. The qualitative problem, I think you've all touched on. There is a kind of alienation built into the modern multiversity. On the other hand, I resent the kind of snobbery values which you saw in Dead Poets Society. And all of the people who hate mass education looked at that and said, that's what that should really be. I think that the reason we're here is because women's studies does offer a different kind of access. It's not only the way it's taught, it's what animates the way it's taught. That same course in Shakespeare, in the context of women's studies, really, Joyce, does come out differently. You may even have the same books on your list or the same films, but there is a contextual difference which suddenly makes it, to some extent, relevant. Now, granted, if you're teaching it in a women's studies course, you're going to use Virginia Woolf and Shakespeare's sister. But I think that access, for me, is more and more not how many get in, but the whole context of a women's studies program, which is quite radical and quite revolutionary, and yet those are not the courses students drop out of. The administrators and men keep saying, oh, that's not going to get you a job, you know, and what do you want that for, and that's not very practical. They know that, but they respond because it's a voice they've recognized. And I'm very thrilled at being part of women's studies courses, which are quite different in style and what motivates them and what, what animates them. It's a different knowledge seeking and a different knowledge building. I mean, the research is folded into the knowledge, and the knowledge is folded back into the research. And there is much more collaborative efforts. I mean, I have difficulties now, and I guess, Margaret, you don't, but I find a real generation gap with students. I really don't understand their music, and I don't understand a lot of their lifestyle. So I can't relate to them the way I might have 20 years ago. But it's a much more collaborative, simpatico effort. Now, I hold my class at home, so we can...
I have some difficulty getting my
47 now. Mine's a graduate course, and we are at home.
Thelma, to just pick up on your point about a different contextual thing there in women's education and what women are looking for. And I find even with young women, again, there is not the same concern about training, which is going to lead directly to a job, that they're much more interested in some kind of self-actualization or self-fulfillment. And if they can handle that one, they can handle anything that's out there. And I think, I'm sad to say this, but I think it's because they know they're still not going to get the top jobs, and they're not going to move through the professional hierarchies the way men do anyway, and that the specialization, which, and I think, Joyce, you made a comment earlier about the whole excellence thing, which is blown out of all proportion, and which really has very little to do with excellence, but has a lot to do with training in a very specific way. And it comes again out of that whole dominance concept of education. Women are not looking for that. It's a totally different thing.
It's not as though, to pick up on that though, it's not just women that are looking at quality. I mean, a lot more young people seem I don't know if it came out of the 60s
I
parents
would
or
agree with
whatever it
that.
is, but they
Yeah.
seem less concerned about, you know, status. The young teenage group are the ones that have come along now. And I don't know if that has something to do with the bomb and other things like that. I mean, because there's a generalized sense among a lot of young people that, well, they're not sure where the earth is going, and so a lot of them just say, you know, the life should be something that you're living every day. There's much more that sense among young people in general. And
Well, the feminists and the ecologists, these movements are certainly, I mean, inseparable now. And I'm interested that I have young men. This summer at the Mount, I had a couple of young men in my women's studies program, and I have them at UBC too. So that you're right, Joyce, that younger people are looking for something quite different.
Well, some of them are. I don't like to be negative in any way, but I just had the experience of teaching Adrienne Rich's essay, Taking Women Students Seriously, to two sections of freshman English, which are, you know, quite a random sampling of the population, most of them younger students, and experienced quite a bit of hostility, I would call it, downright hostility, which was, it was fine. I mean, we had good discussion out of that, but I was quite, in a way, wistful about the young women, because in effect, the men in the class dominated the discussion, and I couldn't, as a teacher, seem to handle that so that it was equally, because the women just were not going to talk, or else they were quite upset. And I did talk to some of them individually afterwards and got sort of clear about this, but what really set them all agog was that the essay is a wonderful thing about what we've just been talking about, and a very famous one, of course. And in the last paragraph, she turns, after being very kind of inclusive of things and caring about women and where they're coming from, and she says, men in general think badly. And then she goes on to talk about, of course, she's criticizing the patriarchal mode of thought, the fallow logos that we've been talking about. But this really upset both men and women in the class. She's criticizing men, they said. And this means she doesn't want equality. And so we had to go back through that. But what did strike me with my conversation with the younger women was that they somewhere have not picked up some of the realities of the women's lives they're going to leap into. They just don't know this.
I've run into some of the hostility too, Donna, but what I found was they listen with two sets of ears. That is, they will give you a big argument about marriage, for instance. You know, why are you always knocking marriage, and why are you always knocking families? And it's, I'm not, you know. But it turns out that they're storing it somewhere back there as a fallback position. They're not ready to make the kind of ideological commitment that somehow I was ready to make, and I made it at a much later age than they did. And after becoming a widow as well, so that I'd had some very good life experience, demystifying. But they do store it up. And whereas they may give you a lot of argument about some things, when it comes to an issue like pay equity, they are the greatest egalitarians. They will not put up with pay inequity on any basis. So I think the teaching problem is selecting the issues and meeting them to some extent halfway on the issues that they see as happening immediately in their lives. The environmental thing, Margaret, has been an enormous surprise to me. Really? Canadians love their environment. Canadians are the most environmentally conscious male, female of any age. They're terribly distressed.
We're also the worst polluters.
Well, they don't think they are, but I mean, we could really organize people around environment so easily in this country. And you're quite right. I mean, we are polluters, but they aren't, and they don't want their country polluted.
I think this is a good opportunity to ask, one of the questions that I wanted to ask you is to have you give some thought as to whether or not the schedule of the courses that are offered and the course offerings in the curriculum are barriers to women going to university. And if you think they are, which I not heard you so much say they are barriers. It's once they get in there, it's keeping them there and giving them what they need. Instead of asking you if they think they're a barrier, I'm going to ask you how you think you could possibly some constructive criticism on how to change the course offerings to make them better.
I'd be dead tomorrow if I proposed that my colleagues all change their course offerings.
Not so much. Well, I hear you saying that. I think I hear you saying that it's not that the courses that are offered aren't a barrier to them getting there. It's what is causing them to be disillusioned once they get into the system. Is that? I think that's what I hear you saying.
Well, it's partly we're caught up in the system. We're required to give grades. We're required to start the courses on a certain date and to end them on a certain date. And we're very much part of a system which is not always in their best interest.
Okay, but if we talk,
universities were built by men for men.
If we talk about women and education in the 1990s, if we're going to continue offering them courses at universities, what types of courses do you see that we need? Or do you want to let that one go?
Well,
or do you want to pick that
I
one
have a few
up?
things to say about that. We've been in a continuing ed center for 10 years.
Okay.
We did a survey in 1981 of non-returning part-time students, most of whom were women. Like, we asked, why didn't you return this year, and so on. And we got answers back, and 43% of those who were polled who answered the survey, which was 100 and some people who answered the survey, mentioned household duties and duties connected with the home was why they could not return. Now, that's 43%. That's almost half of the people who did not return that year. That was their reason. The biggest barrier, I would say, to women coming back, many women come back, is that they have children.
Yes.
If they didn't have children, and in fact the whole society seems to be geared against children. I mean, looking for a house, doing anything. Children are a commodity that kind of have to be got out of the way or have to be taken care of in some way.
Get kicked off buses in
Get
Ottawa.
kicked off. Yeah, and I think that some of the bad perceptions of the general public around the women's movement is that the women's movement is responsible for this child hatred or abuse or whatever, instead of being the agency by which it's been revealed. Because that's what's happened. The women's movement has been the agency by which it has been revealed that structures like our universities are unfriendly to women who have children. Okay, so if they want to go to school and the child is sick, businesses are unfriendly to people who have women. I mean, Kramer versus Kramer, that was some big revelation that when the kid got sick or something, the poor old Dustin Hoffman had to make some arrangement for this kid he had. Well, we've known that for years. And you know, the whole thing about, well, you have to, now I live, my 88-year-old mother-in-law is a permanent member of my household now for the last 4 years. Many women end up with aged mothers-in-law, and they have to structure their schedule around that, so that one of our mature students is saying she was caring for her husband's mother. Her whole coming to school had to be geared around doing that sort of thing. And so if you sit in that chair for a little while, you recognize that those kind of responsibilities that women traditionally have had with older relatives and with their children are one of the great barriers. I mean, if you can't come, some of the programs you can't come into part-time. You can't come into a lot of programs, certain programs, if you wanted to be in them, because you have those other responsibilities. So that's a very unfriendly aspect of... And
you're guilted if you want to give up on some of those.
And if you come in with an excuse, or you call and say that you can't make that exam or for this or that, even if you've got some written excuse from your doctor that your kid is dying of something, there's still that kind of problem. It's like, well, I mean, if you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen, you know. But wait a minute.
Well, the assumption is that you should be staying home and looking after your children.
Well,
And if you're not a good mother. There's something wrong with you.
Yeah, and if you
But there's never an assumption that a husband might structure his work or his life in such a way that there was a real shared responsibility. And I think that's the thing that business and industry and our whole society simply won't deal with. I mean, we don't all have to go to work at 9 o'clock in the morning and leave at 4. There are all manner of flexible programs.
That's right.
And I must say, one of my experiences with Scandinavian countries, that they are much better at flex time and shared jobs and all of the things that seem to be so insurmountable in terms of pensions, and they do it. They just do it. And men do go when the youngster is sick and get it out of the daycare. It's a matter of changing attitudes and giving people an image of a different way of doing it. The interesting thing is, of course, that when you do, and I think we do have a generation of younger men who are taking much more responsibility in terms of the care of the children, they find how exciting it is. It's wonderful to have some responsibility for a small child.
Nevertheless, I think it is the responsibility of the community.
Oh, yes.
That is, I think it involves daycare.
Of course.
Right.
I think it involves some kind of care for elderly people, if it's on a daycare basis or a senior hostel or whatever. And it's the political economy of the state which keeps guilting us into thinking, well, it's your problem or your husband's, and it's a private problem, not a public problem. And as the population ages, it's not going to be babies and little kids we have to worry about. It's the Alzheimer mother-in-law who has to be looked after, and when she goes, then it's your own mother who's Alzheimer who has to be looked after. And until the community assumes responsibility, and it will cost money, but until the community assumes responsibility, all the things women want to do, whether it's education or whether it's fitness building or whether it's quilting, all of those things suffer because the community as a whole, now, you know, who runs the legislatures and who makes those decisions? It's not the woman who stays home with an Alzheimer mother-in-law.
Well, what I see happening is some positive aspect of the funding crisis of upper levels of education is that, in a sense, because we're getting forced into a corner, we have to turn back to the communities and reveal our relevance and to make ourselves more like a community again, which I think is what I see we're moving towards as the university as a community, which has caring aspects involved in it from the beginning, and childcare, flexible scheduling.
You think we're moving toward that, did you say?
I think we have to, yeah.
Oh, we have to, but
Yeah.
I don't see,
Well, are you saying, Donna, that sweet are the uses of adversity? As the universities become more impoverished, they will become better community citizens? As a matter of fact, I'm a little inclined to believe that myself, you know. But
Well, I know that if you're having to go to your alumni for funding, and you're having to appeal to your community for funding if you're a small university in a rural setting in Nova Scotia, then you are reminded quite abruptly of those responsibilities. And so you have to begin to strike a balance between the aspects of the community that you wish to integrate yourself with and be valuable to, and the kind of hierarchical arrangements that have been in place for quite a long time.
You've touched on two issues that we wanted to talk about this afternoon. A follow-up question to the scheduling of courses was whether or not you thought technology could offer any alternative to some of the barriers for the inflexibility that the university system has, and another question we were going to address was the whole concept of funding. I think maybe what we'll do is take a look, if you can, for a moment at how you think technology could offer some alternatives to women going to university or getting a further education in the 1990s. Would anyone like to?
well, I'd be happy to.
I knew you would.
Since I was in some way responsible for the beginnings of this whole duet program at Mount Saint Vincent University. And I think that is the most positive use you can make of technology. The technology exists. We know the fare that is over the traditional media, and most of the programs, they are absolutely mindless. They are used for commercial purposes, primarily advertising, many of it, creating needs which are bad for the community and bad for the people in the community. So that as we find ourselves less able to provide educational opportunities for individuals, they can watch the television and get something which will improve their mind. So that I think if we have more professors who become skilled in using the media as a means of teaching a program, that you are really using technology in a very positive way. And it can release creative personalities out there that we maybe don't, in fact, know anything about. But that, you know, you can't assess. I mean, it's the old thing. You shoot an arrow into the air, it falls to earth, you know not where. And that's what happens with media. But that, to me, is good media.
What about computers?
I'd just like to pick up on that for just a moment, because I think this is a very exciting program, and I think I envy the technology desperately as an educator. But I also think, thinking about my experience of women and thinking back on my own experiences in my education, that I think the balance has to be struck, because I think you need to bring people together. And I think that many women just say, I want to get out of the house for a night, you know. So that in a sense, I think bringing the programs to home is a good step. But I'm sure that you are balancing it, I would hope, with this idea of coming together for purposes of discourse and discussion and feeling the stimulation of just meeting other people and exchanging words. You know, I really am one of those who would like to see that balance very firmly maintained with women's education.
But that is the duet that the people and women do get together at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and watch a particular program, and they can phone in to the professor and ask the questions. It is a two-way thing. It isn't like a commercially prepared production which is beamed out and that's the end of it. So that it is the interactive aspect that to me is the real challenge. Exactly what you're saying, because I agree with you.
Yes.
That people need community, and they need to be able to discuss what they've seen together and to be able to contact the person who was stimulating the discussion.
The thing that, sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say, the thing about computers that bothers me is that I meet many women who don't have access to them because they can't afford it.
They can't afford them.
And so this is a problem for getting them access at the university. There's lineups at our place for the labs.
One of the not experiments, but one of the things we did before the cable ran out to Cheat Harbor was to bus a video up there and to the high school, and then a group of women would gather together and watch the video, as if it wasn't interactive in a sense, but it had that aspect of people from that community, which is relatively isolated. If you've ever been up along the shore to Cheat Harbor, and doing that, it was very time-consuming and very difficult. That busing back and forth, catching the bus, making sure the video went on the bus, making sure everybody was there, and the wrinkles would have to be beaten out of that kind of a program, of course, but ironed out. There's a nice metaphor, not beaten out. You see that? Male metaphors. Anyway, I think that the relational aspect, I remember when I was in an education school, about 1960 maybe it was, a long time ago in Boston, and everyone was talking about teaching machines. Had been the thing.
Oh, yes.
And program text
like
that you never would have to have a teacher again, because you had these program texts whereby if you went to step 2, you'd know you made a mistake, you're back to step 1. And we found that all those things were products of, again, of a male patriarchal system, this idea, and self-teaching, because it's the relational aspect of the coming together that was so important that wasn't taken account of at all with those kind of schemes.
But I can't let this opportunity go by without saying something about public broadcasting and what it used to be. Public broadcasting in this country was the lifeline for women who were at home with small children. They had novels being read. There was good current events. Now, these weren't credit courses, but in terms of enrichment and in terms of giving people a sense of the whole, even though they were at home in the suburbs without public transportation. I was certainly at home with 2 babies, and I had the CBC on at 7 in the morning, and it was on until I heard the news from Pickle Lake at 11. But there was a tremendous social impact of public broadcasting, and it was the women in public broadcasting who were responsible for a good deal of that. Now that, unfortunately, has changed, and with it has gone the sort of loyalties to public broadcasting that people used to have. It was a grassroots part of adult education, and it supplemented this kind of course, course credit kind of thing. You You didn't feel you were ignorant because you didn't have a degree. You had all these people discussing current events and nutrition, and nobody said, well, here's knowledge and here's applied knowledge. It was all something an intelligent citizen ought to know. And as I say, I can't let this opportunity go by without saying universities are not the only source of education, and credit courses and degree courses aren't the only source of education, but we've become more and more dependent on them as our public systems seem to erode. Well, there, I've said mine.
This is a very serious problem for us and for all the democracies, is that we are now we've reached the stage where we have to become pluralistic and participatory, and we have no consensus about training citizens to do that. So we end up doing it piecemeal in the university system here and there, wherever we can, and particularly preparing those who have been excluded from this process, trying to get more voice for those of us who haven't got it, like in environmental decision-making, building hospitals, and so on. And we've made tremendous strides outside of the academy in that direction. But basically, when you have a government who is privatizing everything and getting rid of their social contract, acting as a management team, we are all employees. So therefore, what are our duties as citizens? This becomes a grave problem and a rather terrifying one.
Yeah, it's the commodity mode of doing everything. I mean,
Yes.
that's what I feel. It's like you go into the supermarket, whatever it happens to be, the supermarket of knowledge, you know, the supermarket for food, supermarket for childcare. There's a whole sense about, I use a man who is anathema to most feminists is Norman Mailer, but I remember one of the things Norman Mailer said in one of his essays was that one way you could tell a totalitarian society was you couldn't tell its churches from its supermarkets from its schools and their architecture. And I thought that was, you know, it's true. I mean, the whole, everything is a cinder block, and you tell what it is because there's a sign on top. But I mean, when you begin to feel the absence of any kind of beauty, you know, and any kind of aesthetic, you know, dimension, I call spiritual dimension, let's say, it's very easy to fall into the thing where everything is business, 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 business.
And consumerism.
Yeah, consumerism, and that's how you make your judgments on anything.
Which brings me back to the function of universities in this country, which I think, when I think about if the universities disappear, I think about a country completely demoralized without centers of intellectual and cultural life left, because that's the way it has always been, in a sense. When the crunch comes, we have to function that way. So it is a very vital function, because without it, who would do these things?
I think your comment leads up to the next topic we were going to discuss, and that's the topic of funding of universities. And the question that I had to ask was, will the reduction of general university funding by governments affect the advancement of women in education? I think I'll just keep going down the line.
Overwhelmingly, yes.
Ditto,
Overwhelmingly, yes.
No question about that.
In part because funding affects people differentially, and it will be the mature student and so forth. What is more subversive in all of this is that what funding is left goes into high tech. Not into people, not into good teaching. It goes into something highly visible, competitive, and so that you get scarce resources being used in the most visible way that you can use them, and at the expense of quality in teaching, at the expense of quality in the university environment, and certainly at the expense of students. The kinds of assistance that some of these older students need are the first to go. What is all this about remedial reading? If they can't, you know, if they can't write, they shouldn't be there. And a return to a notion of some kind of merit access, which has to do with increasingly some very reactionary biological model of intelligence, and arguing too many people are being educated. Too many people are being educated. And that is the rationalization used for cutbacks, or what we now call clawbacks, and which I think is a much more appropriate term to describe what is happening with the whole set of social services. There are people in the arts community, economists, supply-side economists, who talk about the arts as, quote, market failures. Isn't that revolting? Well, education is a market failure. It doesn't produce profit.
If you perceive it as a public good.
That's right. I mean, well, I'm not even reasonable on this subject.
Yeah, well, that was my fear when I said that women should not maybe want to access what is held out before them. And you know what?
But they have to because you know they
No,
want
I
to
don't
get
mean
the,
that.
yeah,
I mean they should
yeah.
maybe that the whole idea of talk of it as a commodity and the whole talk of it as profits and balance statements is the why you go after this and you take the things that you know that kind of thinking is.
It's a very grave situation for, you know, I have women who are on welfare and they're really in a tight corner. I'm sure everybody does. And so, you know, but then you see them coming and they're coming and we talk about it and it's like the 19th century novels of the Brontes and George Eliot. Education is the way out of the hole. Education is the lifeline that they have to hold on to. And in a deep part of me, I suppose as an idealist, that is what I think as well. Maybe not quite as directly related to getting a job, but certainly that as well. So if we have these people being excluded under the sign of excellence, what are we creating? We're creating some kind of world which I wouldn't like to participate in either.
Well, it's a two-tier system of those people who are undereducated, underemployed, and under everything, versus those who are the haves.
Well, you recreate the old elitisms, and
the whole
we
class
have only
structure.
just struggled away from that, and it.
But some of the women who are in social services, the system of accessing makes a split between training and education, so that if someone comes in and says they want support to get, say, a BA in something, well, they might get supported if they wanted to take a 2-year secretarial program. But they're not going to get supported if, I mean, there's this differentiation going on
Skills oriented.
through the social services system, so that, you know, it moves these women right back into the lowest paid kind of jobs, you know. And the other part of that is, too, I was just thinking of an example, one of the things that programs that CCLW worked on and proposed, they proposed 2 programs here. Linda Roberts spearheaded that, I think. One was for women in management, so they had this pilot program they did. The other one was for women being trained as auto parts clerks. And at the time they were being trained, apparently the going wage rate was about $9 an hour. But by the time these women all get turned out of this program, educating women, and they went out to work, they were making $6 an hour. And I said, maybe, did you make a mistake? I was talking to one woman who says, I have to retrain all over again because I can't support my family on this job at $6 an hour.
And that's going to happen.
She said, no, it wasn't a mistake. I don't think it was a mistake. She said, I think what happened is now, most of the places that can hire women will hire them for this, they'll hire them for this rate, and so they will drive out the men who, say, were staffing those kind of positions and got that kind of money. So, I mean, it's I don't know, it's a real catch-22, because even when you design a program to help women, let's say, through a training, not, you know, that was a training program. If you get too many of them trained, or if it's successful, then, you know, the whole market just moves backwards.
Well, isn't that why the educational system is ultimately a problem of total economic planning?
Yes, it is.
I mean,
exactly.
you can't do it by looking at schools in isolated.
No.
I mean, there are lots of things you can do in post-secondary schools. There's no reason why a good course in secretarial training shouldn't raise some very fundamental questions about the nature of offices and who is in charge of offices. But I think that ultimately it is the total political economy which shapes the education. Now, you're quite right. The discourse about education is borrowed from this awful systems model in which they were constantly asked to trade off education or health or pay equity or daycare or affordable housing. I've heard ministers of education give this speech over and over again, in which it's a concept of you'll have to be responsible for this trade-off. And of course, you know, all you're asking for are a few paper clips. But suddenly you're responsible for no daycare, or you're responsible for people lined up in hospitals who can't get beds. And it's a game that's played. And until we become much more politically savvy about this rhetoric, we're lost.
But I think that this will happen here, in this part of the country first. And I'll tell you why. It's because we're getting screwed so badly. I only use
This
that
is the
kind of
voice of the
metaphor.
poet, you
Yeah.
understand.
I know, but this is a
poet.
situation. Absolutely. We've had the plug pulled, and there are thousands of jobs lost here, and there are very few alternatives. So we're having to look at things like how are developing countries handling this, and we're going to have to start learning from that end again. I mean, it's coming round to that people are really beginning to say, what about that co-op movement? Where did it go to? At the same time, as overlaid with this, we've got only the high-tech stuff offered out. Let's parachute a multinational in to create jobs with Lytton or Pratt Whitney or whatever, and those
They don't even create that many jobs.
they do
No,
not.
they
They
don't.
create few jobs, and it's an elitist system with engineers and so on at the top, and all the workers at the bottom.
You guys are doing a good job of leading into my questions. My next question was, we've agreed as a panel overwhelmingly that the reduction in funding is going to have an impact on education for women. So do you think that women education will be affected by the trend of universities obtaining funding from other sources, for example, private enterprise?
I think Margaret could answer that very well.
Private enterprise, you know, and I don't, I'm not particularly against the fact that people who put money into something have a desire to see what it's spent on.
Yep.
And certainly in any of the fundraising that I've been involved in, there is a high level of accountability. I mean, if you're going to take 100,000 or hopefully $1 million from some particular company with a particular orientation, there is a sense there that you know, yes, here's a gift, but we would like to think that something is going to come back to us. And I think that's really inescapable. But I have found that in many companies, many of the donations have allowed, certainly when I was president here, allowed us at the Mount to do the most creative things that we've done. And that if you're just formula funded through the government structures, then you're locked into a system where you really don't have a lot of space to maneuver. And you cannot do the really creative things which bring about some sort of total transformation of the institution. So
I think this is the aspect that concerns me, though. What you say is true. When you go after these corporations and ask them to support the university, not for a particular program, let's say, but my concern is with the marriage between the universities and the, more so-called defense contractors. I know much more so in the United States, but certainly in Canada as well. And when I was in Alberta, I mean, I got wind that there was some group there who were doing nerve gas and other kinds of toxic, so-called, they were studying toxins, but what did they, so that was the upfront thing.
That's
but what they
right.
were really studying was, how could they do chemical warfare? And
But
that's
Joyce, the
thing that
people
concerns
who are
me
responsible there are the professors and indeed the administrations of the universities. I am as opposed, and of course, fortunately for us, it wasn't a problem at the Mount because we don't have anybody who's into that kind of research. And I have indeed been challenged by many of my colleagues when I was a president, when I would speak out against this very thing. But until the universities and the professors accept the responsibility of examining where the funding comes from and what it is they want them to do, you're not going to stop that. And you don't have to go any farther than McGill University to see where there are some very large defense contracts come in. And the professors throw up their hands and they say, oh, but we're just doing objective research. I mean, what happens to our scientific research once it leaves our laboratories has nothing to do with us. Well, it has everything to do with them. And I have to say on that one, I think the universities and the professors within those particular disciplines have been very lax and indeed irresponsible in much of what they've done. You mentioned toxic waste as a case in point.
I also am worried about the biotechnological connections.
Exactly,
for
the reproductive technology one, I'm glad you've raised it, Donna, because
Yes.
that's a major concern with me.
But also
And that is
the
one of
market.
the most
yeah.
exploitive of women, and it's
Yes.
astonishing
Yes.
how most of that work is being done by men in the biology laboratories.
Yes.
It's not women
But
scientists.
also being driven by the market
Exactly.
into application in pitifully short times. If you look at the United States in particular is accelerated, but we have the same thing happening here, so that you have university professors who also have biotechnological companies, and the two become indistinguishable from each other, and the biotechnological company operates on the bottom line of profit, of course.
You've
So
had
that-
some run-in with that.
Yeah.
You're
Locally.
right that, you know, it's the research agenda that is
Yes.
very directly influenced. But you ask, well, why aren't they more responsible? I mean, it's all very well for people in the humanities to say, you shouldn't be doing that research. That decision to do that research is tied up with careerism.
Oh, yes.
And it's partly the organization of universities, which rewards professors who get publications, who get on short lists for Nobel Prizes, and who are into a kind of private entrepreneurial careerism. Now, I think all of us have spent years trying to figure out how you organize universities differently so that the rewards of research are intrinsic, so that the rewards of teaching are intrinsic. But we have a kind of competitive academic marketplace.
Well,
And-
it's rooted right
Yeah.
in Baconian science, Newtonian science, Einsteinian science. It's just rooted in the whole myth.
Not Einsteinian science.
Well, maybe not Einstein,
Baconian.
but there are many practitioners in the atomic physicists who are as Baconian as
But
they.
the paradox, I have a scientist husband, okay. The
We
paradox,
need to wrap up soon.
okay. The paradox, I think, is that, you know, a lot of science has carried forward things that have been very helpful to human life and human endeavor, and it's come out of the very same research. And the problem when you're talking, because I've talked to people in the scientific community, is that science isn't bad in and of itself. Like anything else in human life, it isn't bad in and of itself. And so how do you walk the line in a way between, you know, accepting this money, because it's the only way you can do this very expensive research by electron microscopes and all kinds of things you need to have that you can't do this research without, and not sort of sell out to the person who wants you to give them that weapon. And there's no real easy answer for that, I don't think.
Well, I think we do need other
spirituality
people.
and women's morality, and you would find some answers if you look there.
I need to
I almost tipped us over, Margaret.
I need to try to wrap up here for a second. When I asked you what the important issues were, I think the general consensus I got was that there needs to be a transformation of the academy for a much more interdisciplinary studies and more of a global village perspective than what we have right now. And when I questioned you about accessibility, it wasn't so much the barriers to them getting in, it was keeping them there and the content and the quality of the information they were given. You agreed overwhelmingly that the lack of the reduction in university funding was going to have an impact. And I heard you say, I think, that the obtaining funding from a source other than government could have a lot of positive impact and potential negative impacts. It has to be balanced. The question that we wanted to wrap up with, I have two, and I don't know which one you want to address. I know we're running out of time. In what way do you think that women and feminist thoughts are transforming university course content and university curriculum offerings? And do you think that that's going to have an impact on the power structure of Western society? Now, there's a mouthful. You can do that in 1 minute. You're doing well.
Yes. No, I think that we are developing new agendas for our courses and the way we think about learning and the way we think about how knowledge is used. I think I'm paraphrasing Margaret here, that I think we're developing new agendas about research priorities and what they are. It's true that there are spin-offs from military technology that have helped us, but let's us set the research agenda in terms of social needs and see what spin-offs come from that.
Well, I think the women's movement as a whole, and women's studies and the feminist perspective, is bringing genuinely basic changes in the way we look at all of our disciplines and indeed our lives. And I see that the emphasis that comes from women on caring, on sharing, on power with rather than power over is the real challenge, and that many people are now saying, you know, we've had enough of power from the top down, let's get into an organic model, and that is a feminist model.
And Mother Earth needs that.
Yes.
And I think that enough people are aware, men and women and children, particularly children who want to live on after we're gone, that they need what we have to offer, as well as we need to work with them to help this mother bear us.
Okay.
Well, I just have one warning for all of this.
Final words.
Okay, and that is that if women who are coming out into the world in a way they never have before, by the course of action that's been set up for them, they will be running after things and having heart attacks and getting into this action model. They've always had action in the household economy. They've always had that. They haven't had the time for real contemplation often because they've had all of this busy stuff they had to do. Now is a big opportunity when women can contribute in the areas of philosophy, theology, you know, the whole well-being of our planet, because now they can have some time to be more contemplative, to be literary people and so on. Whereas in the past they didn't have quite that time to do that. And so the warning is don't run after the old model.
Okay, we're out of time. I thank you very, very much. Thank you very much. It was very stimulating, and I'm just pleased to have the opportunity to participate. I thank you all very much. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.